Believe it or not, I'm pretty nervous to cover. I genuinely find it to be a very important moment, encapsulation in the history of the fantasy genre. It touches on so many conversations that have been within the undercurrents of speculative fiction for literally decades. And it's one of the most important authors in the history of the genre, coming at the most important epic fantasy author of all time and making points. Whether or not I agree with all of those points, we'll get into. I do want to say before we start talking about Michael Moorcock's epic Pooh, debatably my favorite sentence I've ever said on this channel that is completely valid, I want to say I have immense respect for both of these authors as writers. I think that Michael Moorcock is a bit of an edgelord, a proto one for his time, you could say, but someone I'm glad that wrote this, despite how much I might disagree with it, because I think this is an access point to a lot of these deeper conversations for wider readers to understand the philosophies behind how people write fantasy, the purpose they believe it serves, and also it's just immensely funny. Yeah, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, A.A. Milne, all these old British conservatives. Tolkien's just writing Winnie the Pooh, but is an epic. Goddamn. This might be one of the sassiest things I have ever come across in my decade plus of getting into the history of literature and critic back and forth. And the fact that it's not coming from a critic, but a fellow author to an author is just something you really won't see in the modern era because of just the backlash that would naturally occur as a result. So I want to now give my thoughts on just the distilled major points that caught my interest within Michael Moorcock's The Epic Pooh. Clarifying note, this is not the original one. He continued to revise The Epic Pooh up until 2009, at least is the one that I have found here, which seems to be the most recent. I tried to find the original. It was impossible. Then I realized I should probably anyway just go with what his last and final words are on the matter. Technically, he could still say something new. Michael Moorcock, believe it or not, still alive. Don't die soon. I don't need that happening after I put out this video. So that's the one I will have linked down below if you would like to go through it fully yourself. The reason I'm going to be cutting quite a bit is I'm trying to focus on the parts that are really aimed at Tolkien and Lewis, C.S. Lewis. It's surprising to me how much throughout this article, Michael Moorcock is just kind of shooting at everybody. This does have a vibe of someone who, yes, is taking mostly aim at Tolkien, but it is a 1v20 situation where the 20 weren't even in a fight, and one just showed up and started slapping people to give their thoughts, and I find that funny.
You know, mustache having with whiskers like a rat compared to beans you whack.
This also covers kind of the full gambit of Tolkien's writing. I had kind of read this a long time ago once before, hardly remember it, but I thought it was almost entirely aimed at Tolkien's themes. This gets into his line by line. This gets into his influence, his influences. It's a fascinating, very difficult to digest at times brain vomit from Michael Moorcock that, despite being revised a ton, in my opinion, could certainly still be cleaned up, but I've tried to do that to the best of my ability while keeping the key points that are relevant to this video. But to start off, let's get into what this essay is probably most notoriously known for, and that is Moorcock's attack on Tolkien's themes and allegory. Starting, he claimed that his work was primarily linguistic in its original conception, that there were no symbols or allegories to be found in it. But his Christian beliefs permeate the book as thoroughly as do the books of Charles Williams and C.S. Lewis, who felt morally bound to introduce their religious ideas into everything they wrote. I suppose I respond so antipathetically to Lewis and Tolkien because I find this sort of consolatory Christianity as distasteful as any other fundamentally misanthropic doctrine. One should perhaps feel some sympathy for the nervousness occasionally revealed beneath their thick layers of stuffy self-satisfaction. Damn!
The champion came out swinging!
typical of the second-rate schoolmaster, but sympathy is hard to sustain in the teeth of their hidden aggression, which is so often accompanied by a deep-rooted hypocrisy. Their theories dignify the mood of a disenchanted and thoroughly discredited section of the repressed English middle class, too afraid, even as it falls, to make any sort of direct complaint. They kicked us out of India, you know? Least of all to the higher authority, their Anglican God, who has evidently failed them. You see what I mean? Like, I'm not in agreement with everything Michael Moorcock says there. I actually agree with a good bit of it in some angles, but regardless of whether or not you think he's making points, for the modern lingo, how to put it, bars. Like, he's swinging hard. That's all I have to say. And unironically, this is, funnily enough, the best writing I have ever seen from Michael Moorcock. But it's very obvious to me as someone who has read Elric of Manibene that Michael Moorcock knew he was coming up against, and so he was trying to really step it up.
If you're going to take a shot at the Queen, you better not miss.
And if this seems highly politically charged, which it is, it's probably good that you know that Michael Moorcock is a self-described anarchist and pragmatist. Take that as you will. And he's not entirely wrong here. Despite Tolkien stubbornly stating so many times that there isn't allegory, he detests it in all of its... There's overtly allegorical things to Christianity within Lord of the Rings. And I think there are even things where Tolkien will admit that. It's a complex subject with a lot of gray space. I just think Michael Moorcock is completely wrong to say that he is just as permeating his text with those Christian themes as the likes of C.S. Lewis. That's just not right. One is, like, not to any kind of offense to C.S. Lewis fans, I think C.S. Lewis might even agree with me saying this, Christian propaganda, while the other is Christian inspired, at least in its mythos and character arcs. Where I agree with him more, though, is Tolkien's stuffiness coming across in his text, and coming from a place that is clearly from the oppressed English middle class. I would never read Lord of the Rings and have that like idea pop in my head, but it's one of those things that once you hear someone say it, you're like, I mean, yeah. Like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. But this gets all the more biting as we continue on. It was best-selling novelists like Warwick Deeping, who, after the First World War, adapted these sentimental myths, particularly the myth of sacrifice, which had made war bearable, and helped ensure that we were able to bear further wars, providing us with the wretched ethics of passive decency and self-sacrifice, by means of which we were able to console ourselves in our moral apathy. Moderation was the rule, and it is moderation which ruins Tolkien's fantasy and causes it to fail as a genuine romance. The little hills and woods of that Surrey of the mind, the Shire, are safe, but the wild landscapes everywhere beyond the Shire are dangerous. Experience or life is dangerous. The Lord of the Rings is a pernicious confirmation of the values of a morally bankrupt middle class. Their cowardly home counties habits are primarily responsible for the problem England now faces. The Lord of the Rings is much more deep-rooted in its infantilism than a good many of the more obviously juvenile books it influenced. It is Winnie the Pooh posing as an epic. If the Shire is the suburban garden, Sauron and his henchmen are the old bourgeoisie boogaboo, the mob, mindless football supporters throwing their beer bottles over the fence, the worst aspects of modern urban society represented as a whole by a fearful backward yearning class for whom good taste is synonymous with restraint, and civilized behavior means conventional behavior in all circumstances. That is not to deny that we do not find courageous characters in The Lord of the Rings, or a willingness to fight evil, but somehow those courageous characters take on the aspect of retired colonels, at last driven to write a letter to the times, and we are not sure, because Tolkien cannot really bring himself to get close to his proles and their satanic leaders, if Sauron and company are quite as evil as we're told. After all, anyone who hates hobbits can't be all bad. And that is so much to unpack, Moorcock. And again, there are aspects here where I'm like, bars. But I don't agree with a lot of the overgeneralization. It's so frustrating. And Moorcock, I like the perspective he's coming from more than I enjoy the execution of his argument, if that makes sense. The idea of Sauron and company, as he puts it, being the urban mob that the stuffy English classmen like Tolkien cannot stand, has some merit to it, in my opinion. I wouldn't make it nearly as black and white as this, because as someone who's actually read Lord of the Rings, there is greater nuance there, especially once you get into the wider lore from the likes of the... But this does, at least to me, come across like someone who has the most surface level understanding of Lord of the Rings, and is then extrapolating it to their worldview to make an argument based on their picture of what Lord of the Rings is. And they have like 50% of it right, and they come from a standpoint I kind of agree with. I don't like some of the themes within Lord of the Rings that do kind of fetishize the past and reject all aspects of the Industrial Revolution. Well, there are many, 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 many things as a result of the Industrial Revolution I personally hate. I wouldn't say it's just all bad, the level that Tolkien does take it to in the most extreme reads of his writing. That being said, especially after having read both Moorcock and Tolkien's writing, I personally do enjoy, at least from a creative perspective, the freedom of which Moorcock's unrestrained characterization allows him creatively. While I would never say Michael Moorcock had the line by line that Tolkien did, his imagination is up there with Tolkien's, in my opinion, with the character of Elric of Menibene. And you can see the end result of these two's difference in philosophy of conception of character in how their protagonists read, right? Elric is a far more interesting bad guy trying to be good than Tolkien was ever able to write for any of his antagonists, or in my opinion, honestly, protagonists. Though I love the hero's journey that Tolkien does. I love the pure kind of optimism that bleeds from Lord of the Rings a lot of the times. It's just very different core philosophies. You can love both. I do. I'm personally drawn more to one, especially in the modern sensibilities that Michael Moorcock, if you squint and look past a lot of the flaws in what he's writing here, is getting at. And I hope I'm able to get across kind of the love-hate relationship I have with this article as a massive fantasy fan. It's such a fun encapsulation of the two driving philosophies behind fantasy. And as we covered in my Eras of Fantasy video, in the wake of Michael Moorcock releasing this, we actually saw fantasy rapidly evolving and changing to fall far more in line with the vision Michael Moorcock is arguing for here, if you again kind of squint. And with this being a revised version, we even see Michael Moorcock essentially address that at the end, continuing on. There is no happy ending to the romance of Robin Hood. However, whereas Tolkien, going against the grain of his subject matter, forces one on us as a matter of policy. And he kind of continues this point later on saying, "The great epics dignify death, but they did not ignore it. And it is one of the reasons why they are superior to the artificial romances of which The Lord of the Rings is merely one of the most recent. Since the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, at least people have been yearning for an ideal rural world they believe to have vanished, yearning for a mythical state of innocence, as heartily as the Israelites yearned for a Garden of Eden. This refusal to face or derive any pleasure from the realities of urban industrial life, this longing to possess again the infant's eye view of the countryside, is a fundamental theme in popular English literature. Novels set in the countryside probably outsell novels set in the city. D.H. Lawrence's appeal cannot be in the quality of the writing. It must lie in his subject matter, lust and landscape. If I find this nostalgia for a vanished landscape a bit strange, it is probably because, as I write, I can look out my window over 20 miles of superb countryside to the sea and a largely unpopulated coast."
What the hell are you talking about?
This county, like many others, has seemingly limitless landscape of great beauty and variety, unspoiled by excessive tourism or the uglier forms of industrialism. Elsewhere, big cities have certainly destroyed the countryside surrounding them, but rapid transport now makes it possible for a Londoner to spend the time he would have needed to get to Box Hill 40 years ago and getting to Northumberland. It is neophobia in which makes him hate the modern world and is changing society. It is xenophobia, which makes him unable to imagine what rural beauty might lay beyond the boundaries of his particular shire. And this is where I think his arguments really start to reach to the point of breaking themselves. Do not get me wrong. Tolkien was a product of his time, and there are reads of his books where you can get into xenophobia. He also has said problematic stuff about certain other groups. At the same time, Tolkien gave the middle finger to Nazis, and you gotta love him for that. Low bar, but it's the bar. But where I reject Michael Moorcock's read of the text is pretty much every character that has a devotion to the Shire within Lord of the Rings ends up finding beauty in the external world. Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, Pippin, Merry all end up appreciating aspects of the outside world, seeing the beauty, especially in elves and the world of men, and loving it, yearning for it once they get home in some cases, and the comfort of coming back to the Shire sits with them with varying degrees of difficulty. Famously, Frodo can't stay, and Michael Moorcock, in my read, subjectively, is not understanding that this actual vision of comfort that Tolkien was writing is more indicative not of his views of industrialism, which I think Michael Moorcock is hitting on in other points well, but instead actually tied to his service in World War I, where after coming back from fighting in mainland Europe, Tolkien struggled. I mean, he was in battles and then he had to come back to this English life, and that was kind of this big yeah for him. There are undoubtedly, anyone who has traveled will agree, there are beautiful, amazing things within the world to experience. But especially if you are not just going on comfy tourist trips and you are sent into parts of the world for combat or war, it's not going to be so simple. Maybe I'm being a bit too defensive of Tolkien there. Please feel free to disagree in the comments down below. But I just think personally Moorcock is going a bit too far. Writers like Tolkien take you to the edge of the abyss and point out the excellent tea garden at the bottom, showing you the steps carved into the cliff and reminding you to be a bit careful because the handrails are a trifle shaky as you go down. They haven't got the approval yet to put a new one in. I just wanted to include that line because I thought it was really funny. And again, he just starts taking shots at other authors as well, saying, I never liked A.A. Milne. Even when I was younger. There is an element of con in his tone that a suspicious child can detect early in life. Let's all be cozy, it seems to say. Children's books are, after all, primarily written by conservative adults anxious to maintain an unreal attitude towards childhood. Let's forget our troubles and go to sleep. At which I find myself stirring to a sitting position in my little bed and replying with uncivilized bad taste, fuck that and fuck you too. I really want to know what kind of childhood Michael Moorcock had because, god damn, dude. And let us please not gloss over the fact that Michael Moorcock, with his full-ass chest, in the revised version of this script, he's perused a few times, just called Winnie the Pooh a con.
Oh, bother.
I want to reiterate, I enjoy Michael Moorcock as a character. I think some of the arguments he makes here are interesting. I also think we're in the territory of a bit nutty as well. I enjoy this as a argument piece. I think this is fun. There are angles within the Epic Pooh I think could be correct if they were rewritten, streamlined, and sharpened a bit. But this is so wildly out of pocket. My guy. As a child, I found these books not to show me the respect I was used to from Nesbitt or Richmal Crompton, dyslexia, who also gave me denser, better writing and a wider vocabulary. The Cowardly Lion was a far more attractive character than Aslan, and Crampton Williams' books were notably free from moral lessons. I think I would have enjoyed the work of Alan Garner, Susan Cooper, and Ursula K. Le Guin much more. They display a greater respect for children and considerably more talent as writers. completely agree with everything he is saying there entirely. In fact, I actually think it does a lot of damage to kids, how much, especially children's author, insist on simplifying morals to them. This is why I recommend Garth Nix's books, especially to younger readers, so much. Kids, even if they aren't able to pick up on it in a way where they can express right away, can absolutely take complex moral lessons and understand more mature themes. I am a big believer in that. I don't personally have kids, but I have been around many people who have raised their kids. I have been shown more complex things as a kid by my parents, and I remember them having an impact on me that I couldn't put into words then, but I pondered and had all of them percolate in the back of my head growing up, and I think we do a disservice to children by just showing them thump over the head kind of stories too much, too far into life. Obviously, we're talking about toddlers, that's different. Now, his point shifts here later on in the essay. It's more about the functions of escapism within fantasy fiction. And here I find Michael Moorcock's points to actually be really interesting to discuss, even more so with how the genre has evolved since he put out this essay. Ideally, fiction should offer us escape and force us at least to ask questions. It should provide a release from anxiety, but give us some insight into the causes of anxiety. Lynn Carter, in his Imaginary Worlds, the only book at time of writing the original of this essay I was able to find in the general subject of epic fantasy, offered an argument familiar to those who have read apologies from the kind of sci-fi or thriller buff who feels compelled to justify his philistinism. The charge of escapist reading, says Carter, is most often levied against fantasy and science fiction by those who have forgotten or overlooked the simple fact that virtually all reading, all music and poetry and art and drama and philosophy, for that matter, is a temporary escape from what is around us. Like so many of his colleagues in the professional sci-fi world, Carter expresses a distaste for fiction which is not predominantly escapist by charging it with being depressing or negative, if it does not provide him with the moral and psychological comforts he seems to need. Carter dismisses Spencer as dull and Joyce as a titanic bore, and writes in cliches, euphemisms, and wretchedly distorted syntax, telling us that the pre-Raphaelites were lisping exquisites, and that Fox Madox Brown was a young man attracted to the movement by Morris's fiery Welsh dynamicism, and that because Tolkien got a CBE, we must now call him Sir John. But Carter, at least, is not the snob some American adherents are. To touch on this idea of reading, everything just being about escapism versus also being there to force you to ask questions, I disagree with him here, while also acknowledging there is a higher and lower level to the media you consume. It was just often that people back in the day really couldn't see past the marketing or the medium of which stories were published, and so if you were in pulp magazines, you were looked down on. If you were Tolkien, you were lifted up and praised. And that's very frustrating. I can't imagine how frustrating that had to be for Michael Moorcock in some circles, especially when critics were more aggressive back in the day, to just be shit on. But at the same time, I think, in my read of this, it's unfair to take that angle that Michael Moorcock had to live in and apply it all the way across the board. And I think this is both aged poorly and well. Poorly in the sense that a lot of the snobbery he's talking about has gone away. But well in the sense that I do think there is escapism that has more of a let's challenge you purpose to it, and I respect those stories a bit more, and escapism that is only there for thrills and nothing beyond that. In a recent anthology compiled by Robert H. Boyer and Kenneth J. Zorsky, The Fantastic Imagination, we find the following. In addition to their all being high fantasy, the stories selected here are good literature. Among the writers to be found in the volume are C.S. Lewis, John Buchan, Frank R. Stockton, and Lloyd Alexander, not one of whom can match the literary talents of, say, Fritz Leiber, whose work has primarily been published in commercial magazines and genre paperback stories. For years, American thriller buffs with pretensions ignored Hammett and Chandler in favor of vastly inferior English writers like Sayers. And here we see the same thing occurring with American fantasy writers. The crux of the thing remains. The writers admired are not literary or literate. As often as not, they flatter middle-brow sensibilities and reinforce middle-class sentimentalities, and therefore do not threaten a carefully maintained set of social and intellectual assumptions. And I did not live in this time, but I am sure there absolutely was a bend in critical circles that favored those who had more middle-brow sensibilities and rejected the more, let's say, punk mentalities, I guess, of a Michael Moorcock. In the context of the time he is in, I am not informed enough to disagree with him and am inclined to believe his experience. But he ends all of this with what I consider to be a pretty goddamn funny joke that is immensely self-aware after this reading experience. And bear with me here, because if you aren't aware of all these names, it can be a bit confusing, but I'll clarify. Yet, Tennyson inspired better poets who followed him, who sought the origin of his inspiration and made nobler uses of it. Both Swinburne and Morris could, for instance, employ the old ballad meters far more effectively than Tennyson himself, refusing, unlike him, to modify their toughness. Doubtless, Tolkien will also inspire writers who will take his raw materials and put them to nobler uses. On the other hand, perhaps, the day of the rural romance is done, and we can look forward to seeing more of the grittier urban fantasies of the kind written by China Miéville, Holly Black, or members of the so-called New Weird movement. And I love that. Yep, absolutely. Not that urban nostalgia needs to be any more vital. We have seen too many television series set in depression, appealing to people who sentimentally mourn the disappearance of the old, squalid, vital cities of their youth for days when pubs had carbonized beer instead of real ale, pining for the lost and banned chemical additives to childhood peas and pies. Where is the slush of yesteryear? That last line is a parody of the quote that reads, "Where are the snows of yesteryear?" He's basically kind of talking about slop before slop. He's poking fun at the pretension he's been criticizing this entire essay. But he's applying it to the urban readers rather than the, people pining for the Shire, which I think it's funny. I think that's genuinely funny. And way over boiling it down, he's just rejecting nostalgia as being a valid means of basing criticism off of. He really doesn't want you to have member berries be driving your taste. Don't pine for a simpler vanished world. Don't overly fetishize tradition, and allow new growth to sprout from, the shoulders of giants. And that actually is something I feel like a lot of people can agree with, and is probably the most solid point Michael Moorcock's essay hits on, and fortunately for him, it's where it lands. And I actually quite like how he put it, even in the other areas where I did end up disagreeing with him. And I think especially him bopping specifically Americans on the nose for fetishizing English writing over American writing is just entirely accurate. And I enjoy that he is encouraging people to understand that two things can exist at once. Escapism and challenging you as the reader can coincide, and you can let things percolate in your brain, young, old, while being relieved from the anxieties of the world. All of that, he's spot on. Where I don't agree with Moorcock as much is his assertion that somehow there's something very disingenuous with where Tolkien is coming from. I think if you engage with Tolkien's material on a far more thorough read, Tolkien is coming from a deeply sincere place. And yeah, there's a lot of problems with the world and mentalities he is arguing for within The Lord of the Rings with his upbringing. But I also feel like Tolkien is far more self-aware than Moorcock is giving him credit for, especially if you thoroughly read The Lord of the Rings. I would even go as far as to say that Tolkien is well aware of the problems within the stuffy society he grew up in, and a lot of those faults are subtly put within the Shire, Hobbit culture, and just industrialization. Tolkien, despite his very positive, gleaming view of, heroicism and all this, also had tons of criticisms of the worlds around him. Worlds, plural, his own and those that he encountered throughout his life. I didn't get into this as much as the article because I just found it to be a little too dry to make entertaining. He also attacks Tolkien's prose here, and my guy.
This is not your fight.
Especially when you write like Michael Moorcock. Michael Moorcock is one of the best imaginations fantasy's ever been graced with. And it's fine for him to criticize someone's prose while being someone who writes a bit weaker. That being said, with it being literally Tolkien's writing and coming from who it's coming from, I am also allowed to just go, disagree. And he also seems to, at times in this essay, almost blame Tolkien for his imitators. And I think that's foolish. The artist who inspires is not responsible for those they inspire. That is just something I fundamentally believe, because I have seen how often an artist is misinterpreted and someone will just run off with that. And while that is always unfortunate, it isn't the problem of the artist that someone was dumb or lazy or 1,000 other ways you can take someone's great creation and make something mediocre or blatantly offensive. But what's fun about this is there are actually a lot of slightly less infamous essays from authors during this time talking about fiction, fantasy, sci-fi. And if you would like to see more videos covering these, please let me know in the comments down below, because we're really getting into the weeds here of the fantasy genre, and I'm nervous that maybe the casual viewer might not care as much, but I think these are wonderfully informative little essays or, thoughts or displays of intent to better understand the creative works we love and enjoy. I also recommend you read Michael Moorcock. I know everyone watching this likely has at least attempted to read Tolkien, but Michael Moorcock, once you really get into his work, you can see the kind of philosophy he's playing with. And it does make a lot more sense reading this after seeing how he utilizes the full arsenal of tools fantasy makes available to writers. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And thank you for going through this epic poo with me.